So Ty Rosenthal writes that sex and Tolkien may seem like mutually exclusive terms. He's unpacking the truism that Tolkien's works as a whole are sexless, boyish, and innocent, based on the lack of sexual content in his novel Lord of the Rings. The 1,000-page work contains, as Rosenthal points out, only 3 kisses between men and women. But marriage, love, libido, romance, sex, and sexual violence occupy, if not often centrally, the margins of Tolkien's legendarium. Anna Small points out that Tolkien also includes a range of sexual problems in his legendarium. T.S. and Elizabeth Miller note that the evolution of Tolkien's legendarium shows gradual but consistent revision and reduction of the mythology's references to rape and other suggestions of sexual violence, such that those that remain in the published fictions persist largely as distant echoes. Indeed, as we know, Tolkien went back and forth with a huge number of historical and mythological cruces within the world he spent a lifetime building. The Silmarillion, of course, one of the many texts that I'm going to be discussing today, is made of posthumous works which never reached the final shape intended by their author, as Tom Shippey notes. The history of Middle-earth, compiled by Tolkien's son, Christopher, is testament to his tendency to forge, melt, reforge, and melt again some of the core matter of his legendarium. So the focus of my talk today is sexual violence in Tolkien's world, and how Tolkien's essays, appendices, letters, and wider corpus demonstrate a profound uncertainty about the role of the theme of violence against women. These more violent aspects of Tolkien's world-building seem, at points, to have been immense sources of structural conflict. So, for instance, Tom Shippey describes earlier versions of Lúthien's encounter with Morgoth as more sexually suggestive than later ones. She does not sing for him, as she does in the Silmarillion, but she dances. In the earlier draft of the relationship between the dark elf Eöl and Aredal, as laid out in The War of the Jewels, he takes her to wife by force, but this is later changed to, "It is not said that Aredal was wholly unwilling." This latter phrase raises a lot of questions. If she is not wholly unwilling, then of course she is not wholly willing either. And the very fact that she is enchanted by Eöl could in itself be seen as a vitiation of her consent. Her mind is altered against her will in the first place, drawing her deeper into the forest of Nanelmoth and into the clutches of the dark elf. We see this rewriting of sexual violence elsewhere. In his treatise on elven marriage, The Laws and Customs Among the Eldar, Tolkien at first appears to broach the subject of rape among elves. The Eldar wedded once for all. Many, as the histories reveal, could become estranged from good, for nothing can wholly escape from the evil shadow that lies upon Arda. Some fell into pride and self-will and could be guilty of deeds of malice, enmity, greed, and jealousy. But among all these evils, there is no record of any among the elves that took another spouse by force, for this was wholly against their nature, and one so forced would have rejected bodily life and passed to Mandos. Guile or trickery in this matter was scarcely possible, even if it could be thought that any elf would purpose to use it, for the Eldar can read at once in the eyes and voice of another whether they be wed or unwed. So Tolkien makes what appears to be a reference to sexual violence, albeit one euphemized with this phrase to take another spouse by force. And the inclusion of this aspect of elf custom seems to have caused problems, however, raising all sorts of questions about elves and evil acts, as well as the problem of a victim's rejection of bodily life, which could potentially have ripple effects through the wider legendarium. Indeed, by this token, we would have to ask whether Eöl, an elf, albeit a dark one, would then be capable of rape, although the custom very much emphasized the relationship between the effects of rape upon a married elf. No provision is made for the likes of Aredal, an unmarried elf woman. In any case, when Tolkien came to revise this text, which is itself abandoned halfway through, he omits this particular aspect, and he renders it far vaguer, saying the Eldar wedded only once in life, and for love or at least by free will on either part. Even when in after days, as the histories reveal, many of the Eldar in Middle-earth became corrupted and their hearts darkened by the shadow that lies upon Arda, seldom is any tale told of deeds of lust among them. But in rewriting, reshaping, euphemizing, or spreading a veil over deeds of sexual violence or problems of the vitiation of consent, Tolkien creates an ambiguity. Lynn Whitaker declares this ambiguity especially fascinating, suggesting that through it, Tolkien can advance the plot around the notion of rape without actually representing the act itself. So I'm going to be looking at this idea a bit more closely today, the idea that Tolkien renders rape ambiguous, in conjunction with his writings which show that, at the very least, he himself was uncertain of the role of sexual violence and what impact it might have on his legendarium at large. So rape is a difficult topic. It's difficult to define. It varies between countries. It changes over time. Trying to distill a word so utterly beleaguered with tangled meanings feels like hacking through thorns. Even when one writes about rape nowadays, it is not easily encapsulated by any single fixed definition. We have to differentiate between interpersonal interpretations, such as legal definitions, and personal ones. To me, it was rape. Legal definitions of rape vary not just historically, but geographically. Cultural definitions are equally diffuse, personal definitions remain subjective. Politically, I call it rape whenever a woman has sex and feels violated, offers feminist writer Catherine McKinnon, who admits that this claim will attract criticism for being too broad. And her definition is also exclusionary to people other than women who experience rape. So in many centers, her definition is far from satisfactory. Consent is currently the gold standard for detecting rape. Sex without consent equals rape. Yet this is also a profoundly flawed metric. Giving a verbal yes in a sexual situation cannot be deemed consensual when the situation is caused by coercion, emotional or physical, for instance. How can someone in a marriage forced upon her by an invader, for instance, be thought to be in a consensual setting? Ruth Mazocharis, speaking about the widespread enslavement and subsequent marriage of women taken captive in war, identifies the historical impossibility of gauging consent or coercion in these sexual relationships. She writes, "We cannot know what went through the minds of the many slave women who were sexual partners of and had children with their masters. The fact that they were vulnerable to coercion does not mean that they did not exercise agency. No doubt some women fought back against coerced sex, either physically or by passive non-cooperation. No doubt others acquiesced gladly or even initiated a relationship in order to avoid punishment or to secure better living conditions for themselves or their children." Similarly, how can someone who has been enchanted be capable of consent? Aphrodisiacal magic has at its core violent intentions. Casting a spell to violate someone's sexual autonomy might be considered on a par with the use of date rape drugs or the act of taking advantage of an intoxicated person whose lack of cognitive control vitiates their ability to consent to sex. In a recent article, Lillian Hammond points out the similarities between Eöl and Arundel and the Germanic figure of Wayland or Völundr, the smith, and the princess Beaduhild or Budvilda. In the Old Norse Eddic poem Völundarkvíða, Völundr intoxicates and impregnates Budvilda, and we can see a depiction here of this legend on the gorgeous Frank's casket, which is an 8th century Anglo-Saxon box carved out of whalebone. So we can observe here a similar removal of consent, although neither the Eddic poet or Tolkien make this particularly overt. Miller and Miller wisely outline their stance against what they refer to as the tired debate, pitting accusations of overriding misogyny against efforts to excavate a crypto-feminism in Tolkien's works. Indeed, as Anika Jensen notes, feminist criticism of J.R.R. Tolkien is extensive and contested. Nearly every perspective has been presented, from the belief that Tolkien's women are mere stereotypes to the insistence that he idolized and adored them to an almost religious degree. Now, my paper today does not have the aim of overreading feminist stances into Tolkien's depiction of rape, or to suggest that his depictions, omissions, and rewritings of the topic are examples of misogyny, active erasures of female experience, or glorifications or indeed avoidances of such an untoward topic as sexual violence. Rather, I'm interested in how sexual violence functions in his writings and rewritings, and the effect that these omissions and applications have in leaving these lingering traces of fear and discomfort. So in the very last section of Volume 10, Morgoth's Ring of the History of Middle-earth, Christopher Tolkien lays out some of his father's late writings, which offer a reinterpretation of central elements in the mythology. So in these writings, Christopher says, we encounter exceptional difficulty, fluidity of ideas, ambiguous and elusive expression, and illegible passages, and he dates these roughly to the late 1950s. So here Tolkien's upheaval of his world is considerable, complex, and somewhat tortured. So he remolds, for example, Arda's flat form into a more Earth-like sphere, suggesting that the Silmarillion is a collection of traditions handed on by men in Numenor and later in Middle-earth, and as such are confused with their own mannish myths and cosmic ideas. Tolkien suggests a desire here to redesign the structure of his cosmos and including reworking what he calls the astronomically absurd business of the making of the sun and moon. So much of my talk today is going to focus on the rewriting of this particular sun and moon myth, for reasons that, if you're not already familiar with this version, will become clear. So what does Tolkien do to try and salvage this astronomically absurd business? So we're going to take a look at this former absurd making of the sun and moon as we have it in the Quintus Silmarillion and indeed the Annals of a Man, the latter not straying far from the former in regards to this particular narrative. So we're going to journey all the way back to the beginning of days, to Tolkien's earlier version of this tale. So it may come as no surprise to learn that my talk is heavily centered on Melkor, or Morgoth, the big bad of Tolkien's legendarium. At this point, Melkor is currently dwelling in the outer darkness, while the rest of the Valar are hard at work. Aule, at the prayer of Yavanna, wrought 2 mighty lamps for the lighting of Middle-earth, which he had built amid the encircling seas. Illuin to the north and Ormal to the south, these 2 lamps sat atop high pillars, and their light flowed out over the earth so that all was lit, as if it were in a changeless day. The beauty of this sweet spring in Arda wasn't quite sweet to everyone, however. So Melkor, far off in the darkness, was filled with hatred, being jealous of the work of his peers whom he desired to make subject to himself. In this early assault of the Valar, Melkor assails the light of Illuin and Ormal and cast down their pillars and broke their lamps. So as the Valar rebuild their new dominion in Valinor, 2 slender shoots come forth, and under Yavanna's song they grow into the 2 trees of Valinor, one named Talperion, whose pronouns are he and him, and whose leaves are a dark green that beneath were as shining silver. The other, Laurelin, pronouns she, her, has flowers in clusters of yellow flame and leaves with edges of glittering gold, and thus begin the years of the tree, or the days of bliss, lit by these silver and gold beams, who take it in turns to shed their light over Valinor. Each awakens 1 hour before the other stops shining, and thus in Valinor twice every day there came a gentle hour or softer light, when both trees were faint and their gold and silver beams were mingled. But of course, the light of the trees doesn't last forever either, and Melkor attacks again, now with a new crony, Ungoliant, the terrible spider ancestor of Shelob. Darkness falls upon Valinor once more as Melkor spears each tree to their cores until their bloody sap spills to the ground. And Ungoliant, ever lustful and hungering, sets her black beak to their wounds till they were drained, and the poison of death that was in her went into their tissues and withered them, root, branch, and leaf, and they died. We hear how the darkness that followed was more than loss of light. In that hour was made a darkness that seemed not lack, but a thing with being of its own, for it was indeed made by malice out of light, and it had power to pierce the eye, and to enter heart and mind, and strangle the very will. After Melkor flees again, the Valar pour their efforts into healing the trees. But the tears of Nienna availed not to heal their mortal wounds, and for a long while Yavanna sang alone in the shadows. But even as hope failed and her song faltered, Telperion bore at last, upon a silver bough, 1 great flower of silver, and Laurelin a fruit of gold. The Valar make vessels to preserve the radiance of these remnants of the 2 trees, and they become the silver moon and the golden sun, set forth to voyage upon appointed courses above the girdle of the earth, from the west and to the east, and to return. Now these 2 lamps are given to 2 of the Maiar to guide. The flower of the masculine Telperion, now the moon, is given to Tilion, a hunter and lover of silver. The golden fruit of Laurelin, now the sun, is given to Arion, who had tended and watered the golden flowers before the attack from Melkor and Ungoliant. While Tilion begged to be given the task, Arion is chosen by the Valar because she had not feared the heats of Laurelin, and was unhurt by them, being from the beginning a spirit of fire, whom Melkor had not deceived nor drawn to his service. Too bright were the eyes of Arion for even the Eldar to look on, and leaving Valinor she forsook the form and raiment which like the Valar she had worn there, and she was as a naked flame, terrible in the fullness of her splendor. So Tilion ascends to the sky with the moon first, and he fills the servants of Morgoth with amazement, and the elves with delight. And after 7 circuits of the heavens, Arion ascends with the sun. And Tilion, bearer of the moon, keeps trying to come near her, but he keeps being scorched. Although he's commanded to travel at Arian's speed, he went with uncertain pace and was still drawn towards Arian, as he shall ever be, so that often both may be seen above the earth together, or at times it will chance that he comes so nigh that his shadow cuts off her brightness, and there is a darkness amid the day. But there's one person who hates these new lights. Morgoth, the Dark Lord. He assailed Tilion, sending spirits of shadow against him, and there was strife in Ilmen beneath the paths of the stars. But Tilion was victorious, and Arian Morgoth feared with a great fear, but dared not come nigh her, having indeed no longer the power, for as he grew in malice, and sent forth from himself the evil that he conceived in lies and creatures of wickedness, his might passed into them and was dispersed, and he himself became ever more bound to the earth, unwilling to issue from his dark strongholds. With shadows he hid himself, and his servants from Arian, the glance of whose eyes they could not long endure, and the lands near his dwelling were shrouded in fumes and great clouds. So this is the earlier version. Now in Morgoth's Ring, as part of these texts that Christopher Tolkien says bring about this exceptional difficulty, we can see how J.R.R. Tolkien began to rework this astronomically absurd business of the making of the sun and moon. So Christopher describes this text that will be the focal part of my talk today as a text of a most problematic nature, a manuscript in ink that falls into two parts which are plainly very associated, a discussion with proposals for the regeneration of the mythology and an abandoned narrative. Neither has title or heading. So this text completely resituates the making of the sun and moon, stating that it must occur before the coming of the elves, and it cannot be made to be after the death of the two trees. The legend of the Eldar, Tolkien says, should represent Arda as it is, because they have better knowledge, so it should be close to the reality. So in this version, the sun and moon are made far, far earlier in the cosmic timeline. Tolkien toys with the idea that the valor of the sun could be Tulkas, before deciding that as the sun is feminine, it is better that its valor should be Aran, just as it is in the earlier versions. Here, however, Tolkien adds an element that is quite absent from the Annals of a Man or the Quenta Silmarillion. So Aran is a maiden whom Melkor endeavored to make his spouse or ravished. She went up in a flame of wrath and anguish, and her spirit was released from Ea, but Melkor was blackened and burned, and his form was thereafter dark, and he took to darkness. And after this the sun remained a lonely fire, polluted by Melkor. So this is really quite a departure from the earlier version. Studies of sexual violence in Tolkien's legendarium are nascent, and little attention in particular has been devoted to the rape of Arian. Miller and Miller describe it as the most graphic and least euphemized description of sexual assault in Tolkien's extended oeuvre, and they suggest that Tolkien discarded this primordial rape as he continued to tinker with the chronology and cosmology of the earlier days of Arda. We have the introduction here of a rape narrative, with Tolkien euphemistically using the spouse metaphor again, but then seemingly as an afterthought being more specific. Melkor ravishes her. Ravish is, of course, a complex word, and it's not exactly synonymous with rape, a word which Tolkien seems only to use in its meaning of steal, as in the rape of the Silmarils, the rape of their ships. Ravish and rape ultimately stem from the Latin rapere, meaning to steal or take away, with ravish coming via the Old French ravir and rape via the Anglo-Norman rape. Both would come to gain this additional meaning of to sexually violate. And it's hard to read Melkor's actions here as anything other than rape. The act results in the mutual pollution of both the rapist and the raped Maya. We also have this release of Arian's spirit from Ea. Now, the relationship between the physical and spiritual in Tolkien ranges everywhere from Aristotelian monism to Cartesian duality and many other things besides. And this also varies greatly between the different races. So Arian is one of the Maya, who do not always need to occupy a physical form. But leaving Ea is about as close to dying, I think, as a Maya can come. And it certainly resonates with that abandoned clause in Laws and Customs of the Eldar, which states that one so forced would have rejected bodily life and passed to Mannos. Now that's a treatise on the Eldar, not the Maya, but the sentiment of essential leaving of the living realm is consistent. And this is also consistent with the now eschewed views of what Vanessa Veselka calls the collapsible woman. The idea that a woman is often not perceived to be truly traumatized by sexual assault unless she falls apart completely. So we are now getting better at acknowledging that victims of sexual violence may be traumatized, and this trauma can manifest in a panoply of ways. The collapsible woman is not the benchmark for rape victims. There can be no one model of mental health for an unaccountable number of individuals. The prominent scholar of rape, Joanna Berg, eschews the idea of a trauma aesthetic for rape victims. This does, however, seem to be the aesthetic for a number of women in Tolkien's Legendarium. Okay, so that's the first iteration of these later Aryan narratives. The rest of this text then sort of briefly summarizes the next major events of the age, which include the coming of Orome and the awakening of elves and men. So this next text in Morgoth's Ring seems to follow the same discursive point in much greater detail. So I quote it in full across 2 slides to give a sense of how much detail Tolkien provides here. So here we learn that Melkor's first desire and weapon had been fire and heat. But Tolkien notes the lesser brightness that stands before the greater becomes a darkness, and Melkor was jealous therefore of all other brightnesses and wishes to take all light unto himself. So we then move to this much more detailed telling of that macro snapshot of the ravishing of the Sun Maiden that we had in this previous essay. So the worst of deeds of the wrath of Melkor was seen in the sun. Now the sun was designed to be the heart of Arda, and the Valar purposed that it should give light to all that realm, unceasingly and without wearying or diminution, and that from its light the world should receive health and life and growth. Therefore Vada set there the most ardent and beautiful of all those spirits that had entered with her into Ea, and she was named Ari. And Vada gave to her keeping a portion of the gift of Iluvatar, so that the sun should endure and be blessed and give blessing. The sun, the lore masters tell us, was in that beginning named As, which is as near as it can be interpreted warmth, to which are joined light and solace, and that the spirit therefore was called Azie, or later Arie. But Melkor, as hath been told, lusted after all light, desiring it jealously for his own. Moreover, he soon perceived that in As there was light which had been concealed from him, and which had a power of which he had not thought. Therefore, afire at once with desire and anger, he went to As, and he spoke to Arie, saying, I have chosen thee, and thou shalt be my spouse, even as Vada is to Manwë, and together we shall wield all splendor and mastery. Then the kingship of Arda shall be mine indeed as in right, and thou shalt be my partner. Thou shalt be partner of my glory. So we're told that Melkor is originally drawn not to darkness but to light, but in trying to take that light by force, he and the light itself, as we'll see, have their brightness darkened. Especially interesting here is the dialogue that we have between Melkor and Arie. He offers her partnership in the power that he will attain from her, likening their potential union to Vada and Manwë. But this is not a request that comes from a place of the purity of that particular union. Melkor comes to her with desire and anger, with lust and jealousy. And unsurprisingly, Arie is not convinced. She rejected Melkor and rebuked him, saying, Speak not of right, which thou hast long forgotten. Neither for thee nor by thee alone was Ea made, and thou shalt not be king of Arda. Beware therefore, for there is in the heart of As a light in which thou hast no part, and a fire which will not serve thee. Put not out thy hand to it, for though thy potency may destroy it, it will burn thee, and thy brightness will be made dark. Melkor did not heed her warning, but cried in his wrath, The gift which is withheld I take, and he ravished Arie, desiring both to abase her and to take into himself her powers. Then the spirit of Arie went up like a flame of anguish and wrath, and departed forever from Arda. Indeed, some say that it was released from Ea. And the sun was bereft of the light of Vada, and was stained by the assault of Melkor. And being for a long while without rule, it flamed with excessive heat, or grew too cool, so that grievous hurt was done to Arda, and the fashioning of the world was marred and delayed, until with long toil the Valar made a new order. Also some of the wise have said that the ordering of Arda as to the placing and courses of its parts was disarrayed by Melkor, so that the earth was at times drawn too near to the sun, and at other times went too far off. But even as Arie foretold, Melkor was burned, and his brightness darkened, and he gave no more light, but light pained him exceedingly, and he hated it. The text goes on to relate how Melkor seeks out dark places, and how the Valar devise the moon to bring a new light, although much dimmer, to the places that the sun can no longer go. So we have a much more detailed account of this ravishment, or as I would term it, a rape. We have the gold standard of consent, verbally withheld by Arye. She rejects and rebukes him. Put not out thy hand to it, she says, speaking of the sun, for seeing that his power is destructive. But so too is its power against him. Melkor then lets out this horrific cry, the gift which is withheld I take, a verbal declaration of his decision to ignore her rejection. Now, Tolkien is rarely explicit with sexual matters, let alone sexually violent ones, but here he is quite clear. Melkor ravished Arye, desiring both to abase her and to take into himself her powers. It's quite forensic in its account of lack of consent, his violence and conceit, and his motivation. This rape is committed for his own power and to abase her, to humiliate her. Vengeance, it seems, for her rejection and her effusive defiance of his bid for power. And then the spirit of Arye went up like a flame of anguish and wrath. It departed forever from Arda, or perhaps earth, and this recalls that earlier text with this inferno of emotion, anguish and wrath, forcing her spirit to leave. In marring her, he himself is marred, which speaks to the corrupting effect of rape on both perpetrator and victim within the moral logic of this world. The impact on Arye is also bigger than just her own anguish. The light of Arda is put in disarray by Melkor. To make up for this, the Valar then resolve to make the moon, and it is directed to go ever round and about, bringing a light in dark places from which the sun had departed. But it was a lesser light, so that moonlight was not the same as sunlight. So here we have a sense of what we might call a body politic. The raped woman is more than just a raped woman. And this is such a common aspect of legend and myth as to be a trope. We might think of Lucretia, whose raped body causes a revolution in Rome. Lucretia is not simply Lucretia, but the figure of violated Rome, according to Ian Donaldson. And her body goes on to be a major crux for patristic scholars and indeed politicians for millennia. Arye's rape would, with this mythic background, be caused for the absence of sunlight in Middle-earth. And this certainly brings to mind Demeter, who, at the capture of Persephone, causes the world's crops to die. The coerced marriage of Aradel, too, has much wider narratological consequences. When Aradel wearies of Gondolin and wishes to ride and wander the forests, her brother Turgon forebodes that ill will come of it both to you and to me, and Whitaker suggests that this prophecy posits Aradel's desire as the source not only of her own downfall, but of Gondolin's. Indeed, Aradel's rape by Eöl results in the birth of Maglin, who, like his father in mood and mind, lusts after his first cousin, Idril. When Morgoth promises him lordship of Gondolin as his vassal and the possession of Idril Celebrimbor when the city should be taken, Maglin enables Morgoth to assault the city. And from this we can learn several things. First, that sexual deviance is somewhat hereditary, and we see this in the Akalabeth with Pharazôn, who takes his aunt Muriel to wife against her will, doing evil in this, and evil also in that the laws of Númenor did not permit the marriage. Pharazôn takes after his father Gilgalad, who takes after his father Gimilzor, who took the lady Inzilbeth to wife, though this was little to her liking. Secondly, we see that the rape of the woman is not just the rape of the woman's body. It maps onto the assault of the city, or the disarrayment of sun from sky. It has consequences upon civilizations and the cosmos itself, in this way becoming almost a trope. This attack on Arion is a marked departure from the so-called astronomically absurd version, in which Arion is simply feared by Morgoth or Melkor. In fact, Tilion is the one who is attacked. In light of the later version of the sun and the moon in Tolkien's Legendarium, is this earlier telling entirely free of female anxiety, however? Although, while researching this paper, I came across swathes of Tilion ex-Arion fanfiction and fan art, I wasn't entirely convinced by the potential of this particular romance. Christine Larson describes Tilion's wayward path as the result of his infatuation with Arion. This carelessness results in eclipses. While her path remains steady, he errs constantly, drawn to her immense beauty. According to Whitaker, Tolkien posits female beauty as the catalyst for violent seduction or unrestrained lust, and we see this with Aradel and Luthien in particular. Arion's beauty is no less emphasized. And while she may not be raped by Melkor in this earlier narrative, she is pursued, and she gives no indicator at all that this pursuit is desired. It's also worth thinking about the genders of the sun and moon. Yvette Kizo notes that in this mythical world, Tolkien has switched the traditional gender binaries of the sun and moon. So in Greek and Roman myth, for instance, the sun is associated with the fiery, masculine, strong Apollo, while the moon is more aligned with Artemis or Diana the huntress. Kizo proposes that the change stems from Germanic philology. While in Romance languages we have la lune, la luna, la lune, the grammatical feminine for the moon, and le soleil, il sole, el sol, the grammatical masculine for the sun, in Old English we have seo sunne for the feminine and se mona in the masculine. Similarly, the Old Norse sol is feminine and manni is masculine. And they are also very much characterized in Norse mythology as a female sun and a male moon. So the Eddic poem Vafthrudnismal has the sun called Alfröðr, elf radiance, and she gives birth to a daughter before Fenrir the wolf devours her at Ragnarok, the doom of the gods. So eina dóttir ber Alfröðr, áður hanna Fenrir fari, sú skal ríða það regin deyja, móðir brautir mær. A daughter shall elf radiance bear before Fenrir destroys her. She shall ride when the gods die, the maiden on her mother's path. And much like Tolkien's visions and revisions for the sun and moon, Norse myth is also quite far from consistent on this one. So here Fenrir devours the sun. But in Grimnismal, however, the picture looks a little different. So Skull heitir Ulfur, fölgur inu skýrleita godi til varna vidar. En annar hatti hana hröðvitnis sonnar, sá skal för heiða brúði himmins. Mockery is the name of the wolf who follows the shining goddess to the safety of the forest. The second is called Hate. He is the son of Hröðvitnir, he who runs ahead of heaven's bright bride. So here the bright shining bride, the sun, is bracketed by Fenrir's children, two hungry wolves chasing her to the forest, one in front of her and one behind. So even though one of them is chasing the moon, that is not where the emphasis is placed in this poem. Both of the beasts are pointedly positioned either side of the sun maiden. She cannot escape. And this certainly resonates with Arian's status as trapped in a cycle of violence. In the earlier version of the narrative, she's described as casting off her raiment, and she is as a naked flame, a description which perfectly encapsulates her beauty, power, and yet her vulnerability. Men, like moths, are drawn to her. We also have here a binary of light and dark in two of the most prominent rapes in the Legendarium. So Aradel, the White Lady of the Noldor, is very fair, while Eöl, the Dark Elf, is dark and grim and sun-shy. Arian, the very nexus of solar light, is foiled with Melkor, the Dark Lord. So Melkor, whose pride leads to his fall, has been likened to a Miltonian Lucifer. In Tolkien's infamous letter to Michael Tolkien, he describes how the devil is endlessly ingenious and sex his favorite subject. Tolkien states that Melkor should be the supreme spirit of pride and revolt, not just the chief Valar of the earth who has turned to evil. And Miller state that when Tolkien does include accounts of rape in his writings, he takes care to associate ravishment with unspeakable, even satanic evil. So Melkor is a nexus of corruption. With him, we see a constant source of marring, of him inflicting his darkness. But with this origin myth and the rape of Arian, we see him wanting to take what is good and in doing so himself being marred, staining and in doing so being stained. He can never truly create, he can only corrupt. In another essay in Morgoth Ring entitled Notes on Motives in the Silmarillion, Tolkien offers yet another alteration to the sun and moon origin myth. Here Melkor's rape is merely attempted, and we have yet more motivation behind it. So he says evil is vociferous, but itself barren. Melkor could not beget or have any spouse, though he attempted to ravish Arian. This was to destroy and disdain her, not to beget fiery offspring. So here Melkor's motivation is reduced to destruction. And Tolkien's disclaimer that Melkor did not want to impregnate Arian suggests worries that this might be an assumption. But Melkor cannot create a powerful dynasty with Arian. He cannot create, but he can corrupt, and in corruption breed new strains of evil. The verbs that we repeatedly see Tolkien use of him are things like mar, pervert, corrupt. He also breeds, a very distinguished word from creates. In the Quenta Silmarillion, it is said that some years ere the coming of Orome, that if any of the elves strayed far abroad alone or together, they would often vanish and never return. And their fate is left shrouded in mystery, but with a few clues. So it's said that those unhappy ones who were ensnared by Melkor, little is known of a certainty. For who of the living has descended into the pits of Autumno, or has explored the darkness of the councils of Melkor? Yet this is held true by the wise of Erisea, that all those of the Quendai who came into the hands of Melkor ere Autumno was broken, were put there in prison, and by slow arts of cruelty were corrupted and enslaved, and thus did Melkor breed the hideous race of the Orcs in envy and mockery of the Elves, of whom they were afterwards the bitterest foes. For the Orcs had life, and multiplied after the manner of the children of Ilúvatar, and naught that had life of its own, nor the semblance of life, could ever Melkor make since his rebellion in the Ainulindale before the beginning, so say the wise. And deep in their dark hearts, the Orcs loathed the master whom they served in fear, the maker only of their misery. This, it may be, was the vilest deed of Melkor, and the most hateful to Ilúvatar. So the question of how this breeding takes place is not elucidated, but the enslavement of unwilling elves and the suggestion of this breeding could be suggestive of forced intercourse, especially as the Orcs do multiply after the manner of the children of Ilúvatar. Shippey dryly notes that Tolkien shrank from the notion of depicting female orcs, however, and as we know, Tolkien constantly changes his mind about the origin of the orc. A much later essay in Myths Transformed, however, cements what Christopher Tolkien says is his father's final view of the question: the orcs were bred from men. So Tolkien writes that finally there is a cogent point, though horrible to relate. It became clear in time that undoubted men could, under the dominion of Morgoth or his agents, in a few generations be reduced almost to the orc level of mind and habits, and then they would or could be made to mate with orcs, producing new breeds, often larger and more cunning. There is no doubt that long afterwards, in the Third Age, Saruman rediscovered this, or learned of it in lore, and in his lust for mastery committed this, his wickedest deed, the interbreeding of orcs and men, producing men-orcs large and cunning, and orc-men treacherous and vile. So here we have some elucidation. The mental corruption of men results in orc level of mind and habits, and these men would be made to mate with orcs, producing new breeds. This is potentially similar to the origins of the Uruk-hai, who, at least according to Treebeard, who suggests that they could well be the result of breeding men with orcs. And he says, and now it is clear that he is a black traitor. He has taken up with foul folk, with the orcs. Brrm, whom. Worse than that, he has been doing something to them, something dangerous. For these Isengarders are more like wicked men. It is a mark of evil things that came in the great darkness that they cannot abide the sun. But Saruman's orcs can endure it, even if they hate it. I wonder what he has done. Are they men he has ruined, or has he blended the races of orcs and men? That would be a black evil. Now, it should be noted when it comes to the genesis of orcs and Uruk-hai, in a letter to the manager of a Catholic bookshop in Oxford, Tolkien does say that Treebeard, not being one of the wise, shouldn't be taken as an authority on such matters, as this is just his speculation. This does, however, seem potentially more likely than being hatched out of subterranean embryonic sacs, however. But regardless of what Treebeard may or may not know, this breeding of orcs and men seems potentially to be literally a forced breeding program. And this, as well as the elucidation about how orcs reproduce, certainly raises the possibility that orcs commit sexual violence as they raid and rampage. And now I turn to maybe the only woman who appears to be a possible victim of sexual violence in The Lord of the Rings. Celebrian, daughter of Galadriel, wife of Elrond, mother of Arwen. So in Book 2, Chapter 1, it is said that Arwen's brothers Eladan and Elrohir were out upon errantry, for they rode often far afield with the rangers of the north, forgetting never their mother's torment in the dens of the orcs. And there's a fuller account of this in an appendix. So in 2509, Celebrian, wife of Elrond, was journeying to Lorien when she was waylaid in the Red Horn Pass, and her escort being scattered by the sudden assault of the orcs, she was seized and carried off. She was pursued and rescued by Eladan and Elrohir, but not before she had suffered torment and had received a poisoned wound. She was brought back to Imladris, and though healed in body by Elrond, lost all delight in Middle-earth, and the next year went to the Havens and passed over the sea. And later, in the days of Arasul, orcs multiplying again in the Misty Mountains began to ravage the lands, and the Dunedain and the sons of Elrond fought with them. So she loses all delight. We have another collapsible woman, who again seems to evoke that clause from Laws and Customs, just as Ariel did, no longer being able to tolerate corporeality. Dmitri Mayar writes that even if rape is absent from the legendarium, it is very likely that it is subdued by the prudishness of the sources, as in the case of Calabrian, and perpetrated in actuality, especially by orcs. Indeed, the nature of the origin of orcs and their capacity for interbreeding with humans is suggestive of a very disturbing potential for rape. Turin is haunted by the screams of Finduilas as the orcs carry her away, and he is afflicted, seeing ever in his mind the orcs burning the house of Hurin, or putting Morwen and Nienor to torment. In the cases of Morwen, Nienor, and Calabrian, this vague word, torment, seems in its vagueness to speak 1,000 possibilities. Their torment of Finduilas and their pursuit of Nienor, who fled as in a madness of fear, swifter than a deer, and tore off all her clothing as she ran until she was naked, these all leave enough narrative gaps for the reader to presume sexual torment, or at least to fear it. After the sack of Nargothrond, the orcs had slain or driven off all that remained in arms, and were even then ransacking the great halls and chambers, plundering and destroying. But those of the women and maidens that were not burned or slain they had herded on the terraces before the doors, as slaves to be taken into Morgoth's thraldom. So if not for their own pleasure, then they are taken to Morgoth, perhaps for his breeding program, perhaps for his own pleasure. Jensen suggests that Tolkien decides not to include the hyper-masculine and unfortunately universal phenomenon of using sexual violence as a strategy of war. Indeed, there are other reasons for enslavement that are not necessarily sexual. But sexual violence is a well-known byproduct of war, and even if this is not Tolkien's intention, the potential for the sexual undertone is weighty. Miller and Miller wryly suggest that one never worries much over war rape in Middle-earth, despite its history of conflict, but we may nevertheless wonder about the repeated references to the orcish enslavement of maidens and children in the Silmarillion. After the Ninaeth Arnwediad, Easterlings invade Helum and enslave its people. Brodda, the leader, marries Eiryn, one of the women of Helum. In her recent article on female enslavement in the Legendarium, Claire Moore tracks the story of Eiryn in the 4 versions of the children of Hurin. So in the earliest, the tale of Turambar, Brodda is presumably just one of the people of Helum, who Eiryn describes as cruel and unjust. In Sketch of the Mythology, they both seem still to be people of Helum. In the Quenta Noldorinwa, Brodda is one of the incoming men who serves Morgoth. Finally, in the Quenta Silmarillion, he is identified as an Easterling. And Moore observes how Eiryn changes from a free woman married to a member, albeit a bad one, of her own community, to a member of an enslaved people group married to one of the enslavers. Each subsequent version of the story refines these details to make her circumstances more clearly aligned with an enslaved experience. So, like Aryan, the level of potential violence is increased with incremental iterations. This is quite different from Luthien and Aradel, whose sexually violent narratives are rather diminished. And certainly these details are not added or removed by Tolkien lightly, but the traces of them in the Legendarium remain and amplify female fears of gendered or sexual violence. Ty Rosenthal writes that sex is marginalized in Lord of the Rings, is a destructive undercurrent in the Silmarillion, and is given rare yet frank mentions in Tolkien's extensive backstory of Middle-earth. The title of this talk, Middle-earth Post-Me Too, suggests a reassessment of Tolkien's corpus in light of the Me Too movement, which encouraged women to reconsider their sexual experiences, finding new vocabularies for them, and questioning what it all means to be a woman in a so-called man's world. While sex and sexual violence are hardly abundant in Tolkien's Legendarium, there are whispers and at times great wails that speak of coercion and lack of or inability to consent. The rape of Aryan as part of the origin of the heavenly sun, which Tolkien seems to have considered in the reshaping of his cosmos, raises huge questions as to the place and rapeability of the female body, the corruptive nature of rape on both the perpetrator and the victim, as well as the cosmological or narratological destruction. These questions, it seems, even Tolkien struggled to answer, and we'll never know what role it would truly have ended up playing had he ever finished the Silmarillion himself. But his reforging of Arian's body, beautiful and yet destructive, into a powerful and corruptive force, may have created not just a destructive sexual undercurrent to the Silmarillion, but a potential tsunami.